A little pop culture is mixed into the NPS deep dive this week. I'm turning to likely the most underrated colony and state, especially considering all the action, intrigue, and industry that occurred there in America's early years. New Jersey and the Pinelands National Reserve, or what those of us who have heard of the area would call the Pine Barrens or the New Jersey Pines. This was actually the first national reserve and covers 1.1 million acres of varied terrain, including the pine forest, obviously, but also some meadows and bordering wetlands. Called the Barrens due to its land being inhospitable to farming, which is all anybody who was naming stuff cared about in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Barrens got a bad name. The soil is generally sandy, nutrient-poor, and acidic. Terrible for European farm crops, but great for the trees that live there, as well as unique orchid species and a variety of carnivorous plants. If the soil won't feed you, some plants decided it was time to eat bugs. The people who set up homes there and held on to the marginal farming existence came to be known as pineys. Because of the difficult farming condition, many of these pineys instead turned to forestry occupations over farming. The particularly resinous varieties of trees that grew there meant that this was a popular place to collect and process pitch, wood tar, and turpentine for ships. It also grew copious cedars, which were important for particular ship parts. The apparently endless supply of trees also meant this area supplied a large amount of charcoal for domestic use and export in the colonial age and the early years of America. The acidic soil also meant that the wetlands, or bogs, provided large amounts of bog iron, and all those trees meant there was plenty of charcoal to run bloomeries, then blast furnaces, foundries, and forges. The cannon sent over on that early American naval ship that went and made noise at the Barbary pirates, they were probably made by the ironworks at Hanover, New Jersey, smack in the Pine Barrens. The tree density in combination with numerous rivers running through them would make it an ideal site for many industrial concerns in the wood fire and water-powered early industrial age of America. The lousy farming would also cause it to be the site of the first Indian reservation on the continent, when colonists decided they needed to smush the remaining local Lenape people into one place and try to get them to stop moving about in their seasonal rounds. What the Lenape knew, and what we are just getting a hang of, is that these lands host many unique species of plants adapted to that particular environment. For people who are completely unfamiliar with this area, they might still know of one of its touchstones, the New Jersey Devil. Yep, the Pine Barrens is where he was first noted, and legendarily, it is in this scraggly forest land where he makes his home. So if you're interested in an area that touched on many parts of colonial and early American development and has a touch of Scooby-Doo mystery to it, take a swing through the New Jersey Pinelands Reserve. Episode 96, American Wheat, Better Mills, and Military Bread. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at American wheat in those early war years and how trade with Britain, the rest of Europe, and the Caribbean, and the early American military affected the American wheat supply, the bread supply, and it'll be clear why wheat whiskey and wheat beer were not a thing in early America. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that there were really two axes 18th and 19th century American wheat was measured on: winter versus spring and hard versus soft. And the combination of these different characteristics set up different regional baking styles around the country. Back before plant breeding really took off in the mid-19th century and became interesting to enterprise instead of a thing fussy natural philosopher weirdos did, you simply grew the varieties of food plants that grew best in your area. There might be a bit of selection going on, saving some of the best corn, the strongest wheat for seed, the most vigorous beans, but few farmers had the time, resources, or interest to start actively hunting and test breeding in order to change characteristics. So the qualities of hard and soft, winter and spring, and the color of the wheat were of less importance compared to did it grow well in the circumstances available. So what are all these distinctions? I'll explain quickly as they are going to start to really matter in the next few seasons. First, winter wheat versus spring wheat. These season designations have to do with in which season the wheat is planted. Winter wheat is planted somewhere between late September to November and goes through a dormant period. Once things warm up in the spring, the wheat is then harvested in the following summer sometime. There are two separate reasons and schedules for winter wheats. First, there's the spring planting time comes too late schedule. This is the winter wheat of northern climes, in places where you can barely plant until late May, and with a growth time of 100 to 130 days, there's no way the wheat would be ready to harvest before the fall rains set in if it was planted that late. Therefore, this winter wheat is planted in late fall when it will get moisture but still have time to harden off. That is, get ready to be frozen by moving around different nutrients and then going dormant. And then when the winter snow melts and the ground heats up, it can wake up too, finish growing, and dry out for a late summer or early fall harvest. This was the pattern set in the more northerly wheat growing regions of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and even further north. As wheat growing country spreads west past the Appalachian Range, this will also become the dominant wheat schedule followed there. Our increasing number of light snow and snow-free winters right now may upend these centuries-old patterns, and it is a real concern for 21st century wheat farmers. The other winter wheat schedule happens further south. Here, wheat is planted after the summer high heat, or the summer dry spell, or the summer storms, or some combination of these weather challenges. Here, cooler, calmer, moister weather gives the wheat seeds a chance to germinate and establish before going dormant for cool to cold winter temperatures and the shorter days. But since this winter wheat isn't emerging from a blanket of thick winter snow, it is often ready to harvest in the earlier spring, before all of the challenges of summer weather arrive. The wheat grown in the Carolinas and Georgia would often follow a winter wheat schedule like this for those particular reasons. Spring wheat is the sort that is planted in areas that don't have hard winters and can get crops planted in the early spring, but also don't have parched or stormy summers. In America, that was going to be the mid-Atlantic regions, Virginia, Kentucky, and the Delaware Valley. Then there's the question of soft versus hard wheat. For us out here in the 21st century, we know it has to do with the percentage of protein in the wheat grains. Back there in the 18th and 19th century, all they knew was that some flours made dough that stretched and made chewy baked goods, or hard wheat, and some flours made doughs that were all squishy and the bubbles broke, and they tended to make flaky baked goods, or soft wheat. And back there in the age of we use what grows, the harder wheat just tended to flourish in the colder areas, and the softer ones grew best in the warmer, moister south. Which again, until we started to understand protein in flour, simply meant that chewy, flavorful bread with large bubbles and crispy crusts could be more easily baked from northern flours, and flaky biscuits and tender light cakes from the southern flours. And this will also explain why Mark Twain's designations of northern-style breads and flapjacks and southern-style biscuits and cakes in his list of favorite foods. To the desultory baker who plays around with bread, baking, and cakes a few times a year, this all hardly matters. But for someone who is baking professionally, or once or twice a week, and maybe turning out literally tons of bread and baked goods annually, these differences become obvious through practice and repetition. And to round off designations, there is also red wheat and white wheat. And this simply has to do with the color of the bran on the grain of wheat. Very little is recorded about wheat color up to this period, but that's going to change as we move into the end of the 19th century, so I'll talk about it more in season 4 or 5. I know it's hard to remember now, but wheat's an import, an invasive species, if you will, and growing wheat in early America was far from a sure thing. With the Boston colonies up north, rye grew best, and then barley for beer sort of finally filled in, but wheat came along only grudgingly. As colonization opened up more favorable wheat climates and better farmers in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, and then later in the Carolinas moved in, that is when wheat arrived for sure in the colonies. From there, it would become a local cash crop and over the following decades become an export crop. As we're creeping up on the War of 1812, up to 1/6 of the wheat harvest was being exported. The rise of the mills during the 18th century, both community mills that ran on tolls or payments in kind, and merchant mills that bought grain outright to ship to other places, both helped wheat farming grow. The main recipients of the exports were the Caribbean islands. American wheat was by far the closest and therefore the most sensible to send there. And what wasn't exported internationally? Well, interstate trade was pretty big too. Once wheat-growing regions were established further south, the New England colonies largely stopped growing much wheat. There was much more to be gained in cranberries, dairy cows, fish, timber, shipbuilding, whaling, and growing manufacturing capabilities. So if you weren't wealthy enough to purchase imported wheat flour, the bread on the tables was likely to just be rye and injun, that rye grain and cornmeal bread I have touched on a couple of times, including last week. And if you weren't wealthy enough to even have that kind of bread, it might just be bowls of hominy and syrup, or if you were really at the bottom of the fringes, cracked corn mush. As this period of uncertain country construction progresses, the amount of cash or barter you had to hand over for a keg of flour fell quite a bit. This was due to a combination of demand, supply, technology, and then war. And war here, war there, and then war here again. And with enough war, the supply of flour is going to fall again. And so the price of wheat grains and the milled wheat flour will finally rise quite significantly as we close in on the War of 1812. The first thing that will cause the price of flour to drop and bring a loaf of wheat bread closer to the hands of many more Americans are technological innovations. At the end of my last wheat episode, I talked through the innovations of the Evans mill. It did nothing to change the grinding technology at the heart of the mill, but it thoroughly altered most of the surrounding activities, the hauling of the grain up to the top of the mill, once done by humans of strong backs and impressive calves, and yes, women and men. Don't fool yourself. Outside of the upper class, women who could toss around 50-pound grain sacks all day were more common than we seem to think. Anyway, a grueling human task is taken over by mechanical power. The same power, wind or water, that was turning the grindstone. Some of that same power was bled off into the bolting or the sifting of the flour. A mill that had this ability to do continuous and steady feeding of grain into the mill and then sifting it mechanically, it was simply going to produce more flour. And the mechanical bolting had several advantages. First, it could be sent through multiple stages. If you look at stone ground flour, it is noticeably uneven. You can see it and feel it just by rubbing your fingers through it, and you don't even need magnifying equipment. If you can send it through progressively finer screens, the resulting flour will have far less bran in it, and you can produce flours of multiple grades, including extremely fine white flour that can be sold at a premium. And these were just the expected improvements. A further benefit of the mechanically bolted flour was that it dried faster. When manual sifting had been the order of the day, the warm, damp, freshly ground flour just sat there for a bit and often clumped, and it took more effort to sift, and it stayed damp. It was exposed to air and then dumped back in with damp, sifted flour. But because in the Evans process, the freshly ground flour immediately flowed into the several stages of mechanical bolting, this extra exposure to air meant that the flour dried faster, and the risk of tiny starter pockets of rancidity and fermentation setting up was much reduced. As a result, this flour had a longer barrel and shelf life. So American mills were producing more flour faster with less labor, which meant that American wheat flour became cheaper, which meant it was more accessible to more people. But as it was becoming more viable for shipping around the new country and to the Caribbean, the price went back up due to the higher demand, which means more farmers chose to grow it, which drove to the building of more mills, and so around and around. In fact, it's worth noting that George Washington, as president, approved the patent for the Evans Mill. Well, okay, he approved all the patents, but anyway, he became one of the early adopters. Washington had definitely been in on the early tobacco boom and grew up with the Virginia planter aristocracy that had made bank on tobacco. But by the time he was looking at returning to his farms to live the life of a retired general, retired politician, and gentleman farmer, the glory days of tobacco were past. After all these years of importing tobacco into Europe, Africa, the Levant, Arabia, and South Asia, those areas had taken up growing tobacco themselves. And so the rise of Turkish tobacco, that is tobacco grown in the lands ruled by the Ottoman Empire, not necessarily in what is modern Turkey today. As a result, importing American tobacco to Europe was a losing game. And instead of a way to get rich, American tobacco became a commodity crop, something that made little money individually. It had lost all of its gold rush type luster. And so Washington, like many other planters, stopped growing tobacco at all, or vastly reduced the field space given to this nutrient and labor-greedy crop. He, like so many other planters, moved on to grain production, and this new Evans Mill gave him a leg up in the hunt for efficiency. And Washington, like so many others, had seen that wheat was only going to get more popular and knew that Europe, in its ongoing war strife, would continue to import the grain, as would the Caribbean as long as they turned all their growing space to sugar production. Of course, bread, loaves baked weekly in home ovens or daily at the bakeries in large towns like Philadelphia, Boston, Newport, and New York, were the favored way to consume wheat. This included coarse, brand-spiked bread at taverns served alongside stew, as well as the fine white bread served in silver baskets on linen cloths in fine houses, and everything in between. But as wheat grinding technology was making wheat available to more people and more kinds of people were mixing in the new country, the ways wheat was consumed was also becoming more numerous. Some of the ways were old and homely, and the sort of things not really recorded in cookbooks, but others were new to America, imported with new citizens, new cookbooks, and new recipes received in letters. The oldest ways were the boiled dumplings. Some dumplings were flour mixed with fat or meat drippings and possibly some seasonings. A ubiquitous modern version of a dumpling are matzo balls in the brothy chicken soup of the same name. Granted, they're made with a ground cracker meal, which is functionally a parched corn equivalent for what it's worth, rather than flour. But in the end, they are a wheat flour-based dumpling, so same in the end. Then there are also flat or rolled dumplings. They usually use less fat or none at all and are rolled out to about 1/8 of an inch or 4 millimeters thick. These take less time to simmer or boil to cook all the way through and have sort of a noodle-ish aspect. And these flat rolled dumplings made Italian-type noodles an extension of something that already was present in English and American cooking. They were never called noodles at this stage. Instead, they were labeled things like vermicelli, macaroni, or even simply cut rolled paste. In this Englishified version, early noodles were usually a dough made by mixing flour into whole eggs and then kneading the whole thing into a stiff paste. Then they were rolled out and cut into strips, like worms, so the vermicelli, or rolled into pipes and cut so for macaroni. I mean, that gadget pack rat Thomas Jefferson even had a pasta machine that would press out macaroni tubes. And it wasn't just the Italians. The German tiny dumpling, in modern times often classed as a noodle, spätzle or spätzle, was showing up in soup bowls all over Pennsylvania as they increased their wheat output. These little dumplings are made from a thin dough of flour, egg, and usually a little milk and water, and dropped into soup as long dribbles. Often, the holes in a colander are used, and yes, colanders were already appearing in kitchens at this point, alongside tin kitchens for roasting small meat animals, and of course, the old nutmeg graters. Wheat flour was returning to American puddings as there was more flour to spare. Corn puddings and rice puddings and tapioca puddings will soon leave the original wheat flour puddings in the dust. But for now, at the very start of the country, the increased availability of wheat flour makes original style quaking puddings, transparent puddings, rich puddings, cheap puddings, and a good dish for the sick room made with wheat flour more available. With the greater availability of wheat bread to all, the auxiliary dishes that were made to use stale bread, breadcrumbs, and grated bread were also more common. These days, we often have to artificially make bread stale for use in any number of stale bread applications, like panada, panzanella, croutons, and that class of custard-soaked breads that include pain perdu, eggy bread, French toast, and bread puddings. But as a society that classically had one baking day a week, stale bread, hard biscuit, and grated breadcrumbs were ingredients as expected in their day as milk or lettuce or onions or chicken are in our modern context. As a result, there are pages of breadcrumb items from main dishes to sauces to sweets that feature breadcrumbs as the bulk of the ingredients. Cream, milk, eggs, sack wine, or broth act as a liquid to bind them, and they are flavored with a wide variety of agents from anchovies and various ketchups. Sugar, syrup, spices, and citrus fruits are also used as the recipe demands. For sweets, yes, it's the puddings I just mentioned, the decision of whether to produce mainly a cream or egg pudding or a breadcrumb or stale bread pudding always hinged on whether it was high milk or egg season. As those supplies dried up or precious eggs were brought out of preservation, breadcrumb and stale bread-centric sweets took over from the egg and cream custards. For sauces, bread sauces often took over from the egg yolk sauces as the ducks, turkeys, and chicken output dwindled at the end of summer. Breadcrumbs taking on thickening power in place of the yolk. The thing that starts to appear as brand new in these late 18th and early 19th century cookbooks is the use of flour itself as a gravy thickener in place of breadcrumbs. In the 16th and 17th centuries, yolks and breadcrumbs and boiled down drippings are all common, but in the 18th and 19th century, the instruction of butter rolled in flour or flour worked into butter starts to appear. What we find labeled in the 19th and 20th century as the French technique beurre manier or kneaded butter. This new technique has the chance to become popular with the rise of all of these new large flour mills and the development of the new habit of buying flour from merchant mills. Up until somewhere in the 18th century, it was much more common to keep wheat as whole grains and then only grind it as it was needed for bread. This was largely because bread and whole grains are much more resistant to spoilage than the flour of the day was. Just as with the old school cornmeal I spoke of last week, this flour was stickier due to the inclusion of the germ, so it had additional oils compared to modern flour, and it also wasn't kiln dried, so it also had more intact sugars and some different starches. It held together in a damp sort of way modern flours won't. It was also much more attractive to all sorts of creepy crawlies out there of the visible and invisible sorts. Whole wheat grains have their outer shell or bran to protect them, and bread has lost most of its simple sugars due to the yeast action and the high heat of baking. Taking away the moisture and the sugar cuts back on these items' ability to go rancid or get chomped on by all manner of bugs. As a result, only grinding flour in the amounts that you would need became the order of the day. Already ground flour wasn't something that was found in every kitchen to hand as it is today. But with the rise of so many mills and the ability to just go out and buy flour at need meant that the sprinkling of a bit into gravy to give it a bit of body instead of laboriously cooking down gravy or meat drippings was now more possible. And the people who worked in kitchens loved this innovation, for it truly did save time and effort and stretched other expensive provisions. But there are plenty of people, truly lots of people in the French cooking sphere, who believe that the arrival of wheat flour and later cornstarch adulterated or even completely ruined the art of sauces. All the same, when we go visit our new, as of 1803, port of Nouveau Orleans, or New Orleans, we'll see the earliest inklings of the most famous, at least in our modern ages, use of wheat flour and fat, the roux. But here in America, where we're always in a hurry, I mean really right from the start, we were fine with the arrival of what would become red-eye and sawmill gravies. Stay tuned. Those sauces would even eventually become nearly meals in themselves, and they absolutely depended on flour. And so, more available flour, much more usable than whole wheat grains, or at least more quickly usable, became an essential component of war food and adventure food. Being able to purchase large quantities of pre-ground flour from merchant mills meant forts could be supplied for months with the making of bread, especially with this new mechanically bolted flour that stayed good for longer. And men on the march heading out to forts of the western frontier or for the War of 1812 were more likely to get some wheat flour instead of just cornmeal, hominy, or parched corn than their brethren in the Revolutionary War or earlier wars like the French and Indian War, that is, the American extension of the European 7 Years' War. The Discovery Corps expedition, that is, the Lewis and Clark jaunt, they helpfully listed that they brought along nearly 300 pounds of flour at the start. The food journals indicated that none of this was made into proper bread. Instead, it went into dumplings, fire cakes, and puddings, with final dustings thickening up soups. Yeast-risen bread baking technology as it existed at the dawn of the 19th century was not friendly to fast-moving, well, for their day, scientific expeditions, especially those made up entirely of men. I know. But recall that Sacagawea wasn't there at the start and never took on the roles pioneer women would on the trails that this expedition started to lay out. And in a party of about 45 men, that 300 pounds of flour wasn't going to last that long, nor was it meant to. Even the longer-lasting flour really didn't last that long. I mean, it would have been a pity to lose the precious stuff to damp or beetles or millipedes. But men on boats, well, they were the least likely to get wheat flour. Mostly for the reason I talked about in season 1. Flour on boats was just inviting bugs to come and eat it all up. There might be a bit eaten up as plum duff and dumplings near the start of a journey, but it was simply folly to keep it for long in deep storage. Now, this is not to say the seafaring population, whether Navy, merchant, or pirate, went without wheat products, but the form it usually came in was biscuit. It will become known as hardtack through media associated with the Civil War, but in these early war years, men on boats and men on the march for war and adventure, they most often got their wheat as biscuit or ship's bread. Ship's biscuit was rarely baked by home bakers. It was an industrial product. In the 17th and even the early 18th centuries, British ship's biscuit was made by regular bakeries that were contracted by the Navy or the military generally. But by the middle of the century and going forward, the sheer size and power of the British Navy as it was circling the globe meant that biscuit factories with multiple ovens were constructed to meet the demand of millions of biscuits annually. And by the 19th century, much of the biscuit operation would be entirely mechanized, which was a relief of sort because that meant no more biscuits needed by bakers' feet. I mean, foot kneading ended up being reserved for the bread going to the London slum dwellers and other poor sorts who wouldn't get this fancy new mechanized bread. As with warfighting tactics, which were shared on all sides of the French, Dutch, Spanish, British, and American navies, so were general provisioning rules. So the new Americans began turning out these little hard, slow-baked pucks by the barrelful. Generally inedible as is, on their own, they were regularly broken or crushed, and then soaked in all manner of liquids to be consumed. The older the biscuit, the harder it was, and the larger the portion of bug protein it contained. This is why biscuits were usually tapped before being eaten to knock out the passengers, or eaten in the dark, or crushed up and made into mush in stews like lobscouse and chowders. Anything to not have to think about the bugs. Between these increased uses of wheat in America and the ongoing desire for American wheat to be exported, farmers were always going to find the regular old grain selling for desirable prices. Merchant mills had great markets for the flour, so they would pay tempting prices. But even the unground grains were selling well. Yes, exported to the Caribbean to feed the owner class, but also to Europe, as several things happened to make importing wheat all the way over there profitable. The Industrial Revolution was really getting cranking in England, so there were just fewer farmers, and England stopped being a wheat exporter and started flirting with being a wheat importer. Also, there were just a few wars going on. Napoleon was trampling fields all over as he added to his empire. Oh yeah, and he was conscripting soldiers left and right, and getting guys killed on both sides. So the total number of farmers and farm hands was being done in as well. Then there were a few bad weather years that really beat up the wheat supply and definitely emptied out any reserves different areas might have been holding on to. It's because wheat had all these profitable uses. It wasn't worthwhile to turn this status grain into beer and booze. America isn't going to bother with it at this stage. Rye and corn whiskeys, along with all the fruit brandies, those were ways to preserve the value of excess. And at this point, there was no such thing as wheat excess in America. Alcohol was what to do with the extra grain and fruit that couldn't be eaten or sold at favorable prices, because everybody had plenty. Putting in the time and effort to brew and then distill liquors at this time and place was significant, and portions of the process were, yes, sitting around and watching and judging, but there's also a fair bit of back-breaking labor, setting up the still, chopping the wood, handling the mash and the small wines, and of course, dealing with the dangers of fire. So selling the grain with the least effort put in for a good price was the ideal outcome, and wheat was always selling for good prices. Because the flours were coming out of these newfangled mills were more stable, American flour from Evans Mills was always ever in more demand. So there just was no excess. So in America, we continued to make good beer from barley and bad beer from molasses, and ardent liquors were the way to preserve the excess of good years. So we made brandy from cherries and peaches and ever so many apples, and rum from molasses that came from making sugar. Notice there's no maple rum. Again, not really excess maple sugar. And whiskey from rye and corn. Until we get fancy in the 20th century, America will never see wheat beers and wheat whiskey except as an occasional oddity. Next week, we'll take a look at what's going on with America's fish problem. If there's one thing we really need to learn in the how not to column, it's the colonial and early American fish and stream management policies, or entire lack of policies. They were very, very, very bad at those things. Next week, I'll look at what they thought they were doing, and why, even though there was still plenty of fish, there was no warfish. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on the variety of internets at THoAFood. And thank you to all of you who've been leaving me reviews. It helps me reach out to the history and food curious alike. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes and other ways to get in touch with me are also in the show description.